Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Darryl Stickel. Now, Darryl is an expert on the subject of trust, and he's written about it and has built a business on that on trust called Trust Unlimited. And we really delve into, what it takes to build trust, how ephemeral it can be, and how easy it is to break it. But he has a model where he talks you through how you can go about building trust and being in a position and being in a place where you can be trusted and where you can trust people, and how you can build that when it does get damaged. So in a world where we are seeking and hoping that we can trust our leaders all across the different spheres of the world, this is a very, very timely topic. And Darryl has dedicated his life, really. He did his doctoral thesis on the subject of trust going back some years back. And he's dedicated his life working in his own consultancy, Trust Unlimited, really working with organizations, helping them to create and build trust in their organization. So fantastic guy, wonderful expert in the subject matter. And I really, really encourage you to listen to it. If you like the podcast, and I hope you do, and I don't understand why you mightn't, but if you do like the podcast, we would love you to give us a good review on wherever you listen to your podcast, because that does help us get the message out to more people, and that is the object of the exercise. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy Darryl Stickel. Darryl, thank you so much indeed for being a guest here on the Winning Teams podcast. It's a great honor to have you here.
It's fantastic to be here, John.
Well, we're going to have a great conversation about a topic that's very close to my heart. And obviously, I know it's very close to your heart, which is all about trust and how you build it and how you build upon it. But maybe just to give the listeners a little bit of context, maybe just kind of give a quick backstory as to how you got to where you are right now.
Sure. I was born and raised in a small town, northern British Columbia, Canada, which meant that we were forced to really depend and rely on one another. It fostered a sense of community. And so I developed a level of empathy that through a series of experiences that may be uncommon, and started working towards becoming a clinical psychologist. And then I realized, working with families in crisis and troubled teens, that a lot of the folks I was working with were just doing the best they could. And I thought, if I keep doing this for the rest of my life, I'll go insane. And so I transitioned, working in native land claims and other places, came to the question about trust and why people seem to trust me. And so I went to Duke and wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments and trying to understand long-term disputes and conflicts. Left there, went to McKinsey & Company, big management consulting firm, and started to apply those concepts. And then after about 2 years at McKinsey, I was injured in a car accident on the way to a client site, ended up with post-concussion syndrome. And so started my own small consulting firm called Trust Unlimited. And I've spent probably the last 20 years helping people understand what trust is, how it works, and most importantly, how to build it.
Yeah. And can I guess you, Darryl? I mean, I just think it's really interesting that when you went to Duke and you did your thesis, that your thesis was on trust. Yeah. Why did you decide to actually go that direction and to do a thesis on trust?
So when I was working in native land claims, they asked me, sort of deep philosophical question. One of them was, what will BC look like 50 years after claims are settled? And they said, what does self-government look like? The last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for 100 years they should trust us? And I thought, wow, that's a really good question. And it gets to the heart of conflict resolution and understanding how we collaborate more effectively. Trust just seems to be such a foundational piece for us to get along in society and in the world. It just felt like a really important topic.
It's interesting. I know that you talk about your upbringing, your background in the book, and I thought it was very interesting that when you talked about your father, and and the impact he had on you, but because he was, in a sense, and I hope I'm actually paraphrasing this correctly, but you hugely admired him because he got injured and he could have retired and taken a payoff, but he was determined to actually become whole again,
Right.
and did that. But he also, you had a challenging relationship with him too, and was that some part of kind of something to do with trust, and that's kind of sparked something in you?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's a story of resilience that he demonstrated that runs through my life as well, through a lot of different challenges and issues that I faced. I think it pushed me to have more introspection, more reflection, and to be more accepting of others. You know, the struggles I had with my father stemmed from really different worldviews and a very powerful narrative that he had about himself and about the world, and that I didn't share.
Mm.
Um, and so, you know, for me, a lot of that led to me sort of thinking about that relationship. You know, it ended well, but it was turbulent for most of it,
Yeah.
and it caused me to think about what was the role that I played, because so often when we run into problems, we have an external locus of control. When we're struggling with someone else, it's all their fault, and that
Mm.
wasn't the case, right? I played a role in that situation as well, and so helping people develop that sense of other, I
Yeah.
think, is powerful.
One of the things, and we'll come on and talk about, the book that you've written, Building Trust.
Yeah,
But when you stand back from it, and I mean, and you talk about it in the book, is that, if we look around the world right now, what people are really looking for is to have trust in the leaders. I mean, trust in leaders, and right across the spectrum. It's
yeah,
in the political world, it's in the business world, it's in religion. It's in all sorts of places, and that trust has been eroded hugely
yeah,
over the last number of years. That people are now becoming quite cynical that it's not going to come from there.
yeah. And you're right. You're absolutely right. And for those who can get it right, what a powerful opportunity this time in the world is. You know, it's a huge source of competitive advantage if you can actually get it right and
Mm.
build trust effectively. And I think a large part of this, you know, one of the thought experiments I like to encourage my coaching clients to go through is what if there were no villains? What if it was actually the systems and the structures and the nature of the environment right now that's causing this? Um, we know there are bad guys, but not everyone we run into who's behaving badly is actually rotten to the core. Sometimes they're just stuck in a situation that leaves them with few options or feel like they have few options. And so I think the profound spikes in uncertainty we're seeing in the world, because I think about trust as a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. As uncertainty's gone up, it's made trust harder.
But it's also interesting, Darryl, as well, that when you think about trust, and I suppose, I'm thinking of it because it's the world I operate in, which is in the
Yeah,
corporate world. But when you think about trust, I mean, it's not black and white. It's not there are good guys and there are bad guys, right?
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
because it is the good guys who do things that erodes trust, and it can be just the inconsistency by what I say and what I do, right?
Absolutely.
And I'm just curious, when in your book Building Trust, and you talk about Trust Unlimited. Maybe you might just expand, when you talk about Trust Unlimited, what that is and what is the model.
Yeah, so I developed a company called Trust Unlimited, and we try to help people. Building trust is a skill, and unfortunately, overwhelmingly, people believe they're more trustworthy than average. So 95% of people believe they're more trustworthy than average, which means that when there's trust problems that arise, it's always somebody else's fault. And what Trust Unlimited does is it tries to help people increase their ability to understand trust and think about it in a different way, and has a practical applied approach to building trust. So we have workshops that we do, we have the book, and we're developing more materials to help people systematically go through and understand how trust works. And, there's a lot of success stories, but one of the ones that I find compelling is the fact that we've been able to work with people who are really technically skilled, but struggle on the people side. And they've said, oh my God, you've given me a model. You've given me an equation, a formula for actually talking to other people. And we've seen huge improvements in their ability to engage and interact with others.
Yeah. So before we get into that, can I just go back? What is your, just when I was listening to it, I just thought, what's your definition of trust?
Trust is the willingness to be vulnerable to somebody else when you can't completely predict how they're going to behave. And so it's a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. And a lot of times I'll ask people, who do you trust? Who trusts you? When we get to the who trusts you part, they're stuck, right? How would I know? And it comes from that definition. Everything comes from that definition, the model, the conversations. It's how can people make themselves vulnerable to you, and then do they? And so
give me the definition again, Darryl. Just repeat that again.
It's willingness to be vulnerable to somebody else when you can't completely predict how they're going to behave.
Okay.
So if I'm a leader and I'm asking myself, do my people trust me? Well, here's some questions. Do they give you the bad news first, or are you the last to know? Do they push back against ideas? Do they take risks? Are they willing to make mistakes? Do they tell you what their real development needs are? Those are all ways that they can make themselves vulnerable to you. So if they're not, then maybe the trust levels aren't quite where we'd like them to be.
And there's an element in there that I can't know what I don't know. So if there isn't trust, then nobody is actually going to tell me I don't trust you.
Right.
So how do I get to know that I'm not trustworthy, because no one's going to tell me?
Well, so let's start with, there are some organizations that do surveys that measure this stuff. Not always really well, but there are some organizations that have started to measure it. Unfortunately, what they do is they measure it and they say it's not great. Hey, you need to fix that. And then the leader says, well, okay, well, how do I do that? And the response is, well, we don't know.
That's not very helpful.
No, and the biggest gap we tend to find is the gap between how much leaders believe they're trusted and how much they actually are. I think good hygiene would suggest that people should be thinking about this topic and thinking about what are the practical steps I can take to actually build it. And, at the risk of sounding like a huckster, buying a book called Building Trust would probably help some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a situation whereby, okay, so I don't realize that I'm not trustworthy, or people don't feel trusted, because also if I don't trust you, then I'm highly unlikely going to go and actually tell you that.
You are not. Yeah.
Right. So how is the person going to know that they're not being trusted? And if they actually do get to know that, how do they start to rebuild it? Because they're not starting from zero, they're starting from minus.
Right. So one of the leaders I worked with at a company that measured trust had a score of 13 out of 100, which is not great. And I worked with her for about 3 months. We had coaching calls and conversations, and I demonstrated the model. And then we had a conversation with her team about, here's the different elements of trust. So there's uncertainty, vulnerability, perceived outcomes, there's our emotional states. Let's walk through and systematically talk about each of these. And what could she do to look more trustworthy? What could she do to demonstrate to you what's the information that you need? Took 3 months, and then they did a repeat of the survey, and her score went from 13 to 80.
Wow.
And now it's 100. And so part of that is, we changed the vocabulary, because you're right, there's a social stigma about saying I don't trust somebody. It makes us uncomfortable. And so just asking people isn't always the best way. But if we start to break it down into, and we've got a survey that does this, that starts to talk about, where's the uncertainty coming from? So do you believe you have my best interest at heart? Do I believe that? Or do I believe that you have integrity? Do you follow through on your promises? Are your actions aligned with the values you express? Or do you have competence? And, you know, those are the three levers that were first presented by Roger Mayer in 1995. And then there's elements of the context. So uncertainty comes from two places. It comes from me as an individual, and it's those three levers: benevolence, integrity, and ability. And it comes from the context that we're embedded in. And so there are times when we trust people without knowing them at all. You know, you go to your doctor says, take off your clothes, and we do, right? And, you know, John, all we have to do is change that context from a hospital or a doctor's office to a bathroom at a gas station, and it goes from credible to creepy in a heartbeat, right? Exactly the same people, exactly the same vocabulary, the same conversation, and the response is dramatically different. Well, we can see that as well in different settings all over the world. And so understanding how to clarify my context, how to take steps within my context to make it easier for people to trust me, understanding how to pull the ability lever to have a conversation about what does good really look like, understanding how to pull the integrity lever to be consistent about the promises that I make and be clear when I follow through on them, because sometimes there's a mismatch between what I've promised and what you think I've promised. Mm-hmm. And then the benevolence piece is showing that I have your best interest at heart. You know, when I work with families, I'll ask the parents, who here has their kid's best interest at heart? And all the hands will go up. But when I flip that question and I say, well, what would your kids say? It's about a third. And so if it's hard for parents to get that to land in a place where it's supposed to be obvious, how hard is it for a leader? When there's mixed objectives, when there's so much going on, it's so chaotic, and they've got so many different people whose needs they're trying to balance, and plus the needs of the organization and the needs of their team and their own needs. How do they communicate effectively that they have someone else's best interest at heart?
Yeah. So when you're talking to clients, I mean, if you, I mean, the example we were talking about was kind of one-to-one, but if you look at a team and you say, okay, well, the levels of trust are low, and you can identify that for various reasons. How do you go about fixing that in a team?
So a big part of the success we've seen, I've done some work with a global software company called SAP, and they've got a very challenging environment because it's virtual teams, global, so cross cultures, and they're tech experts. So they don't always get hired for their people skills. So there's a significant challenge that they face. And I worked with a subset of that group in the HR area with an incredibly brilliant leader named Kelsey Trigg. And her team is doing incredibly well in terms of their trust scores and their client satisfaction. And from her perspective, it's all about having a shared vocabulary. It's about having a shared understanding of what trust is. So we had the definition that you and I talked about already, but a shared understanding of the different levers that go into that. I believe that there are, I have 10 in the book, 10 different levers that we can pull. And understanding those levers and how we pull each one of them and being able to communicate effectively around those things actually makes it so much easier. Because it's much easier for me to talk to you about uncertainty than it is about trust, or about how I'm experiencing vulnerability, than it is to me to say to you, hey, this is your fault.
Can I go back and ask you about the model? Sorry, because I started talking about the model, then I went away from it. Can I just come back and just maybe talk about the model that you have?
Right.
And how that works.
So I believe that when we're deciding whether to trust someone, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. And the first question is, how likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty. And the second question is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability. And those things combine. Uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. If we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. And if we're beneath it, then we do. And if we use that framework, then we actually start to be able to diagnose problems and unpack problems that we're facing. Because if uncertainty is high, then vulnerability has to be low in that model for us to still fit under the threshold. And as relationships get deeper, the uncertainty starts to compress. We get smaller and smaller ranges of uncertainty, which means the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And so for us to actually build trust is fairly simple, John. It's where does uncertainty come from? How do we take steps to reduce it? Where do perceptions of vulnerability come from? How do we take steps to reduce those? Now, after we've had an interaction, you and I are having an exchange right now, and I'm having a wonderful time hanging out with you, I'll have a perception of the outcome of this event. And that will then feed back into my next interaction with you. And, in a perfect world, you and I would have multiple opportunities to engage and hang out together and have conversations like this. And each time it acts as a piece of information for our next engagement together. And in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike somebody else. And the stronger those become, the less rational we are. And so a lot of the existing literature, there are places where I differ from 99% of the trust literature that's out there. One is the inclusion of context. Two is the inclusion of vulnerability. Most research treats trust like a dichotomous variable, like it's either present or absent, like an old light switch. Three is the perception of outcomes piece, the realization that we interpret the world through stories and we can have exactly the same experience and have dramatically different perceptions of what just happened. And four is that inclusion of emotions, because existing literature treats people like they're rational actors. And I don't know if you've met people before, John, but we're not always rational, right?
Ain't that the truth? Yeah.
Yeah. And so us having these sort of different dimensions that we can talk through and places that we can plug in, we all have the ability to build trust. Some are just better than others. And we all have the ability to get better.
Mm-hmm.
And so
yeah. Just going back to one point you're making there, Darryl, which I think is really interesting one, and not one that I was kind of reflecting on, is, and if I got you correctly, was that okay? So there's a kind of a process for building trust, and we can go in that. But at the end of the day, how well that goes or not go is impacted by fundamentally whether I like the person or I don't like the person.
It has, liking or disliking someone else has a powerful impact. You're a likable guy, so you probably experience an easier life than most of the rest. And so if we can generate positive affective states, get people to like us, then the world's an easier place to be. And there are ways we can do that, right? So we can dress well, we can try to fit in, we can say positive things have a positive story about other people, which tends to make them want to have a positive story about us. It creates a norm of reciprocity. It's why conflicts are so resilient, because when people get into that negative mindset, when they hate somebody, all of the cognitive rational stuff that exists in the literature is useless. We have to be able to reset those emotional states before we can actually start the work.
Isn't it interesting, Darryl, or at least I think it's interesting, that when you look at it objectively and calmly, coldly, whatever other word you want to use, and you say, okay, trust is really important, because if my people don't trust me, then it creates all sorts of issues.
Right.
So you would say, well, isn't it obvious that everyone should work really, really hard to be trustworthy? And yet, what we were saying at the very beginning was the level of trust is actually pretty poor as a general comment.
It's the lowest we've seen. Yeah.
So isn't it bizarre that the thing that we know we should be manifesting is actually the thing that we're probably doing terribly badly at?
Yeah, and this is the frustrating element, John, is that there's a bunch of barriers that cause people to avoid building trust. One is it's too complicated. I can't do anything about it. It just is what it is. Well, it's not. And I've had 20 years of experience helping people fix these things. So I know it gets better, and I know we can do things about it. One of the other barriers is that whole kind of it's not me problem, right? The 95% of people believing that they're more trustworthy than average means that they feel it's somebody else's problem to deal with. And so often I have leaders come in and say to me, boy, my people really need some work on this. Yeah, they're not the only ones. And the feeling like, oh, this is a long-term solution and I've got so many short-term problems. And the reality is a lot of those short-term problems are trust related. And if we can get this right, life goes so much easier, but it's an investment now for a payoff later. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of barriers that get in the way. It doesn't need to be this hard. And partly it's about getting the signal through the noise, right? There are people talking about trust right now, and you could listen to them for hours and be no better off. And so it's the question of, how do we listen to the right people? How do we have the right conversations? And how do we actually start having a practical applied approach to making this better?
So if somebody listening today and saying, okay, I recognize I have, I know that there's, I might have a problem with trust, or I know that I could be doing better at trust. Right. What is the one thing that they could start doing today that's going to help them to build trust?
So, great question. And the best ways to build trust with others, and I would start by saying, we all have the capacity to get better at this. So even if you think, hey, I'm doing great at this, there's room for improvement. And trust is the differentiator between leaders who are merely okay and those who are exceptional. The more senior we become, the less direct control we have over outcomes, the more dependent we are on those that report to us. So this is something that everyone should be thinking about and investing in. The way that we start is a bit of vulnerability ourselves. So maybe sharing some information or talking about the constraints that you have, or goals and aspirations that you have for the group and for yourself. So making yourself just a little bit vulnerable, because it initiates a norm of reciprocity. It gets people to want to respond in the same way, and a little bit of benevolence. So actually asking people, what matters to you? What does success look like for you? And this is, one of the things we do in the programs that we deliver is we've got these sort of multi-week training programs where people are practicing and applying this. And we'll give them, a template for a conversation. We'll give them a framework to have a conversation with someone around, what does benevolence look like to you? How can I actually make that happen? How can I be more transparent? And what are your needs? Because a lot of times we assume we're being benevolent, but it doesn't land that way. And I got to tell you, I hear so many leaders say, well, I do all those things. And my response is usually, says who? Because if it's me telling you that I'm benevolent, it doesn't really carry as much water as you telling me you think I'm benevolent.
Darryl, this is a fantastic subject matter, and I certainly recommend anyone listening to go off and buy your book and read more about it, because it's a fabulous topic. It's an important topic. It's actually a fundamental topic in business and in life. So I think it is a topic, and obviously your expertise is very considerable. Speaking of books, two questions I ask everybody is a book other than your own that you read that's had an impact on you. What's the book and what was the impact?
So the book is Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And it was written in the late 60s. It talks about how economists versus political scientists react to changes in the environment when things start to go wrong. Right. And economists talk about exit, and political scientists talk about using voice. Has a pretty significant impact on me in terms of the way I was thinking about relationships and how we can create positive barriers to exit to make relationships more resilient, to make client relationships or our team relationships more resilient, and how we can activate voice so we get feedback. I guess if I were to pick a second one, it would be Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Good book.
Great book. Great book. Second question is daily rituals, if you have them and you're happy to share them, and how they serve you.
So I believe that happiness comes from being aware about the things that make us happy that we have control over, and trying to do just a little bit more of that. Mm-hmm. And so there are a couple things that make me happy. One is being a dad. I have two sons that are the center of my world. And every day I try to think about, how do I have a positive impact on their lives? And that in part stems from a relentlessly positive story about them. Mm-hmm. And so I try to share that positive story with them every day. So that they've got a bedrock from which they can take risks in the world. They can go out, the world can be a hard place, but I want them to know that there's a safe harbor. and I'm it. And so I think each day about what are a couple of things I can do. And the other is stuff like this, sharing I have a huge passion about us better understanding trust, having better relationships. And so each day I try to reach out to the world and make it a slightly better place.
Darryl, that's a great message. I love that. Thank you so much indeed for sharing that with us. Before we wrap up, can you tell us how people can get in touch with you and get your book? We'll put everything in the notes, but if they're listening right now, how they can do it right now.
So my email is darryl@trustunlimited.com, DARRYL @trustunlimited.com. My website is trustunlimited.com, and there's a blog section there with all kinds of free stuff that they can access. And the book is available almost anywhere you would order a book online. It's available in electronic form or hardcover. It'll be coming out on Audible in the next few weeks.
Darryl, thank you indeed so much for being a guest here today. I've loved the topic. It's one close to my heart, and it's great to talk to an expert on it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.